For several years now, I've seen automotive projects struggle with worst-case timing analysis. In this talk, I'd like to point at some of the problems and explain the reasons behind those. Why we need a new worst-case timing approach for automotive. That's the title of the talk, and I'd like to start with a little story. And as every story, this one begins like this. Once upon a time, in a country far away, there was a wonderful kingdom. It was reigned by a wise and friendly king and his even wiser and beautiful queen. They had, of course, a lovely daughter, the princess, who lived in a tower and, as you can see, had very long hair. She loved to show her hair and do whatever it is that princesses do all day. However, from time to time, all this happiness was interrupted by a horrible dragon who wanted to get the princess. So, when the dragon came, the princess had to quickly go back into her tower and lock it. And this leaves us with a very obvious and pressing question. How long does it take the princess to get inside to safety when the dragon comes? Well, that's a bit tricky to answer because she needs to get her hair up first. And as you can see, the hair is very long, okay? And as in most of these tales, we also have a prince. In this case, the prince of static code analysis. And he states, "Only I can tell thee the worst case to get back inside." Let's stop at this point, okay? I think I owe you some background, some information what this is about. What is static worst-case analysis, for example? So this is what the talk will contain. I'll give a brief introduction, motivation. We'll talk about basics of worst-case timing analysis, and then I'll point at the problems that today come with this type of analysis. And finally, I'll come up with some suggestions how to solve these problems. Finally, I'll wrap it up with a summary. So let's start with the introduction. First of all, why care about timing altogether? Well, the answer is quite simple. It's impossible to build a safe and highly available, reliable, embedded system without rock-solid timing. Full stop. That's just how it is. If you don't properly care about timing, it is very likely that it'll get you in the dark, meaning that you'll run into timing problems probably in a late phase of the project, and then you have to have some sort of task force to fix things, and that's not a good idea. So better care about timing from the very beginning. Finally, there is a lot of potential for saving a lot of money. And in my book, Embedded Software Timing, I am giving several examples actually, and there's one example where we were able to save an OEM 12 million euros by timing analysis, timing optimization. So I think that's a pretty impressive number, and so timing analysis does matter, certainly. Why care about worst case timing? Well, first of all, the typical safety standards for automotive, avionics, medical, and so forth, railway, they all state that when you reach a certain safety level, you should do static analysis in order to also address the corner cases, which you hardly or cannot test at all. And to cover those, static code analysis is a very good idea. Increase availability. Again, some corner cases. I mean, regarding safety, you can always have some kind of checker whether your system is still safe, in a safe state, whether timing is correct. For example, some kind of watchdog. That's the top level checker, if you like. However, you certainly don't want that to fire in really in the productive software, because yes, the software would be safe, but only by withdrawing functionality. So the availability is a problem then. And you might find yourself like this guy here who, well, he's perfectly safe, but he's not really functional very much anymore. Basics of timing analysis. Okay, let's start with the definition of worst case execution time and worst case response time. And if you look at this timing diagram here, you see a time axis, you see a priority axis. On the priority axis, there are 3 tasks, task A, B, and C, and we're looking at the timing parameters that refer to the first instance of task B. I'm not going to talk about all the timing parameters outlined here. I'll talk about execution time and response time. So first of all, what is it that we see? Well, we see different colors, and the colors actually indicate the task state over time. I'm referring here to the OSIC or AUTOSAR classical platform definition of the operating system task states. And the bright color indicates ready state, dark color running state, brown color waiting state, and finally, if you don't see anything, that's the suspended state. Okay, so here you see, for example, that task A preempts task B. Okay, so execution time. Well, the core execution time is simply all the dark blocks summed up. Okay, so whenever the CPU actually processes our task, that adds up to the core execution time. The response time, again, very simple. It's just a time difference between the start of the task and the termination of the task. Okay, including all delays or preemptions, interruptions, whatever happened there on a scheduling level, that all counts in. Okay, so the worst case execution time now is the maximum possible, the theoretical absolute maximum of the core execution time. Same for the worst case response time. That's the maximum possible worst case response time. So anything that could possibly happen for the worst case response time, it does happen. So all the interrupts that could come in, all the other tasks that could come in, they actually occur, and they add up to the worst case response time. Okay, so overview of timing analysis techniques. So let me briefly talk about the timing analysis techniques, and I kind of reflect them onto a layered structure here with 3 layers: the code level, the scheduling level, and the communication level. And what I mean by that becomes obvious when you look further to the left, where we kind of have the different things, you could say, we are looking at. So on the top level, it's really inter-product communication, if you like. For automotive, this would be car-to-X, meaning car-to-car communication, or car-to-server. Okay, so really even beyond the border of a single vehicle. Then we kind of step towards a single vehicle and look at that, at the network of one vehicle with all its ECUs and buses. Okay, so, and then we step even further and look at a single ECU, which might contain several processors. These processors have different CPUs. The CPUs have different cores, and each of these cores runs an operating system executing tasks and interrupts. They call runnables, they call functions, which call subfunctions. The functions consist of basic blocks, which consist of machine code and instructions, and each machine instruction is executed with several opcode states. So here you've got really the complete bandwidth, and that's how it's mapped onto the code level, scheduling level, communication level. And now you've got the different timing analysis techniques, measurement tracing, for example, which is the observation of the real world. You have the simulation-based approaches, code simulation, scheduling simulation, and finally static code analysis and static scheduling analysis as the model-based or static analysis techniques. And these are the ones we're going to look at in more detail today. First of all, static code analysis. So here you can see the workflow actually. So we've got our static code analysis tool here, and we feed in the executable, so the binary, ELF file typically. There is a very precise model of the processor, which is built into the static code analysis. Then we need to feed in annotations. I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. And finally, the configuration, like clock speed, wait states, what kind of memories are available, and so forth. The result is a report that gives you upper bounds of the worst case execution time. Also lower bounds for the best case execution time, but that's not our focus for today. So already this is a bit complicated. So let's say what people typically have on their mind when they think about static code analysis is actually a more simple view here on the right. ELF in, then you run the analysis and you got the worst case execution time out. And that's kind of the marketing message you typically get. It's very simple, so it's what people remember and what they think they get from static code analysis. These annotations, as we will see, they will be a bit nasty. I'll talk about those in a minute. Static code analysis now in more detail. Let's assume we have a function, some function. So what does the static code analysis do? How does it work? So first of all, it takes a binary and disassembles the complete thing. If you're looking at some function, obviously we're mostly interested in the disassembly for that function. Then it identifies all the jumps and calls and builds up a call tree, as you can see here on the right. Now, using something called abstract interpretation, the longest path through the call tree is now identified. And as you can see, there are some loops here. And obviously, you need to identify the maximum number of iterations for those loops. So the analysis itself makes sure that the worst situation regarding cache and pipeline is considered, meaning that the cache is really in the worst possible state at the beginning of the function, so that really the maximum core execution time is observed. Same is true for the pipeline. Does the result depend on the input or the test data, the test vectors? The answer is no. And that's the great advantage of static code analysis. You don't have to think about, what could be the test vectors? Have I tested everything? Because the result will make sure that all of that is considered. However, to get there, you might need to annotate. Yes, and again, I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what is the output? What does the output look like? So here's our function, some function. And now we have a certain curve, which is the probability over the core execution time. So here you see the core execution time and then you see the different time values for this core execution time. How probable is it to occur when the system executes? And there's some kind of curve here, and at the lower end we have the best case execution time, at the upper end we have the worst case execution time. The thing is really how this curve is shaped and what it exactly looks like, and even the worst case and the best case, that's something only God knows. Okay, so we cannot calculate it, not with in limited time. What we do get from these kind of tools is a safe upper bound. Okay, so some value greater than worst case execution time. Yes, and then obviously that you have some sort of gap, that's the overestimation, and obviously you want this gap to be as small as possible. Static scheduling analysis. So initially I plan to talk about that also quite a lot and give more examples later on, but in the end I decided to focus more on the static code analysis. Anyway, let me briefly explain how static scheduling analysis works. So we have the analysis engine here. In this case, there's an underlying precise model of the operating system, of the scheduler. So we're not looking at the code level, we're looking at the scheduling level. Therefore, we don't have the processor model, we have a model of the operating system. And what we feed in is the operating system configuration. So which tasks exist, which interrupts, what are their priorities, and so forth. And also the best case and the worst case execution times. Okay, plus the activation patterns. So for example, task A gets executed once every millisecond, or activated at least. Right, the output is constructed traces, if you like, for worst case scenarios and the worst case response time. So the underlying mechanism here, or math, if you like, is this response time analysis term, which I'm not going to explain in detail right now. There's a nice explanation in the book. Anyway, we have a more simplified version again, where we could say the OS config goes in, the worst case execution time goes in, then we run the static scheduling analysis, and what we get is the worst case response time. Okay, now I've explained how these things work. Now let's look at the problems. And to start with, I'll go back to our little story. So, the prince of worst case execution time analysis did his maths, and everybody is eager to hear the result, of course. So princes, okay, what's the worst case execution time? Prince, 2 hours. Princess, what? Well, says the prince, a meteorite might fall onto the end of your bunge, blocking it, while a cow passes by, getting trapped in your hair, while... And then he goes on and on and on and adds up reasons that could possibly delay the prince's getting inside, and all of that happens at the same time, concatenating certain events, each of which is very unlikely to happen anyway. But, I mean, that's what he does. And the princess is just speechless. Upon which the prince just suggests that she should cut her hair and dashes off. Well, he doesn't solve the problem, does he? So just cut away a lot of functionality. That's, well, for many projects, that's not a solution, is it? So that was the tale. How about the real world? Okay, so what we do at Gliwa a lot is firefighting. Well, that's how we call it. So projects get in touch with us and they are facing timing problems, timing issues, and they ask us for help. And then our experts go there and help out. And in most cases, I'd like to think we're able actually to help. One of the examples I'm thinking about in the context of this talk is one project. It's an ASIL-D automotive project, so really safety relevant. And it started in 2021 and still ongoing, so it's very up to date, the whole topic. The OEM requirement, one of the OEM requirements actually was that the worst case execution times had to be provided for all tasks and interrupts. Okay, so now I'll talk about annotations. So these are the things that you need to add to the worst case execution time analysis in order to be able to get, well, some sensible output. I'll explain the background of that now. So the abstract interpretation, in many cases, it's not able to determine the upper loop bound of loops, for example. There are other things like indirect function calls, but I'm not going to talk about that now. So let's focus on the loop bounds. Okay, so here you've got some code example, and obviously the duration of this loop really very much depends on the value of variable a here, because that defines the upper loop bound. So now if the analysis cannot determine the value of a, the upper loop bound, well, it has to be very pessimistic, meaning that it will choose the greatest possible value. And if we're talking about a 32-bit controller here, the unsigned int data type will be, well, 32-bit, meaning that the maximum value for a would be 2 to the power of 32 minus 1, which is a big number. It's 4 billion something, okay? Now, if the software developer actually looks at the code and says, well, no, I know that function, and I know that the upper bound is in fact 42, then, well, you see there's a great gap. 42 there, 4 billion something there. Okay, and obviously the impact on this gap here between the worst case, the actual worst case execution time, and the upper bound provided by the tool can be huge. So what you need to do then is tell the tool that indeed A is 42. Okay, and you do that by annotations. So you add more information to the analysis. Now the problem is, in real projects, you have many of such annotations. And with every new version of your project, of your software, well, you have to reconsider all these annotations or update them. And so in the end, the whole thing becomes very, very time consuming. And what I observed is that what I think are more pressing issues, greater problems, they get neglected because so much effort is spent into doing these annotations. So that's one problem. The other problem is, well, all the software projects we're dealing with, they are really big collaborations. So many partners involved, and you've got third-party code that's available only as object code. So now when you have your analysis and you see like very big high loop bounds and you want to annotate them, very often you don't have the source code available. You don't know anything about the code. It's object code that you're looking at. So annotating that becomes very difficult and error prone and thus dangerous, because you might specify a relatively low value, and in fact in rare cases the value might be very big, and then you might miss the worst case. Right, so let's talk about probability for a second. Okay, so today's approach regarding timing and timing requirements is that through, for example, your scheduling analysis, you identify certain maximum allowed values for the execution time, which then turn into timing constraints or timing requirements. So you might find out that, or might specify that the core execution time of your task B has to be less than 1 millisecond. So for safety critical projects then, this is interpreted as the worst case execution time of task B has to be less than 1 millisecond. And since we don't know the worst case execution time itself as such, only God knows, as you know, it is implemented as the upper bound has to be less than 1 millisecond. Okay, so the probability of the worst case execution time really being present in the real world, in the project, while the software is executing, the probability of that might be very, very low. And when I say very low, I mean, think of something like winning the 6 out of 49 lottery 1,000 times in a row. Well, you'd be so rich you wouldn't care about anything else anymore. But I mean, that's very improbable, but it's not impossible, right? Or think of a pot of paint that you blast. You explode that thing in a hole, let's say. Then you wait until the paint settled and dried out, and then you walk over there and look at it, and you'll find like, well, that's weird, there's text. And then you start reading. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then you go on reading, and you'll find that, the whole Bible is there on the floor. Again, extremely improbable, but not impossible. And finally, just imagine all humans on this planet would be wiped out within the same second by their individual shooting star. Again, super improbable, but still possible. Do such events play any role in our real life? No, they don't. Not at all. So why should they when it comes to timing analysis? And that brings up the question, what is it that we actually need? Okay, and let's first look at what ISO 26262 requires. So the standard actually defines something like the FIT 10, or which is like there shouldn't be more than 10 failures in 1 billion hours of operation. So that's the requirement for ASIL-D ISO 26262 projects. Okay, it doesn't say it has to be error-free, but the number of faults has to be below a certain limit. Okay, that's one thing. So the problem now with this, let's say, the core execution time that corresponds to this FIT 10 is somewhere, and we don't know where it is. So we cannot say it's got to be below the CET FIT 10. It's not possible. The other thing I would like to bring up is a definition of a new term, which I call the real world worst case execution time. And so what is that? Just imagine that at the end of the lifetime of your project, your software, and that could be in, I don't know, I mean, think about some old-timers being used, today's cars as old-timers. Maybe that's in 70 years or 100 or even 150 years. Anyway, so at the point in time when really the last time some function got executed, you kind of look back and look at the maximum core execution time that occurred over all these years, over all the ECUs. And that would be your worst case, your real world worst case execution time, because that was the maximum and there will not be any further execution. So you're not going to get greater than that. So actually now what we need is that this value is below our constraint, isn't it? Again, that's a tricky thing to identify. So that's why I also put this in the red box here, because we cannot simply say, okay, it's here, at least not at the beginning of the lifetime while we develop the software. But I think it's important to think about what is it actually that we need. I don't think it's the theoretical worst case execution time. Right, so now a different topic, and that's again something that's, I think, rather drastic. The worst case rarely is the worst case. So what do I mean by that? So the worst case, static worst case code analysis tools typically do not consider interrupts. What do I mean by that? Well, the assumption is there are no interrupts, because the pipeline state and the cache state might be disrupted and so forth. So the values you get from worst case execution time analysis, they only can be used if there are no interrupts, if the code that's analyzed has not been interrupted at all. So here comes my question. How many embedded software projects work without any interrupts at all? I don't know many. Similar situation for multi-core. So the whole analysis only holds as long as there are not any other cores interacting with the crossbar, with the memory interfaces and so forth. So another stupid question, how many multi-core projects are there which only use one core? A ridiculous question, forget it. And so it goes on. Similar situation with DMA. So when you use a DMA, that also interacts with the memories and not considered by worst case core execution time analysis. And also cache writebacks. So the assumption is that data caches are disabled. Well, as I've mentioned, in my experience, I have never come across any embedded project that would fulfill these requirements. And consequently, the worst case people use in their safety relevant projects, it simply is not the worst case. It is not. And if you now talk to the tool vendors of these kind of tools, so what shall I do about it? I do have interrupts, I do have multi-core, I do use the DMA, and I do use the data cache. Then you get a funny answer, and that is, well, you can actually measure the impact and estimate the figures and kind of put that into some special sort of annotation. What? Measure? Estimate? Didn't they tell us for years that only the Static analysis with its mathematical approach is the only path that leads to heaven, that leads to truth. And now all of a sudden we should measure? Come on, that doesn't make sense at all anymore. So, what can we actually do? I think we really need to step back. And what I propose is that the OEMs, the tier ones, timing tool vendors, and timing enthusiasts just get together, round table, and then we start a discussion of what are the facts, what can we agree upon, what are actually the needs, and what are the requirements. And finally, then we might find possible solutions and in the end, kill the beast. Because that's what we need to do. Summary. Embedded software timing does matter. So I think we can agree upon that. The OEM's worst case execution time requirements can lead to poorer software quality. I've seen that in real projects. And I'll give you one example. I'm thinking of an ASIL-D project that added some kind of degradation concept just in order to address the theoretical worst-case scenarios. They could not reproduce that, and they were pretty certain that this is not ever gonna happen. But they still added this degradation concept. So they added a lot of complexity to their software. And adding complexity to a safety-critical software is never a good idea. So it doesn't make sense. Addressing a purely theoretical approach actually binds resources, so consumes resources, and moves the focus away from some real projects you might have, real problems you might have to solve. Okay, it's not like, I mean, if we had any time of the world, all the time of the world, then yes, of course, it would be very interesting and helpful and okay. But I found that what I think are more important problems get neglected. They're not addressed because you don't have the time. So, as I mentioned, let's get together and find a better approach. The current approach simply doesn't fit the needs. So I talked about a story and a little tale, and I'd like to finish with another tale that's well known, The Emperor's New Clothes. And I think he's been wandering about for too long now in his underwear. Everybody cheering and everybody seems to be happy, but yeah. So I feel a bit like this little boy here pointing at him and saying, actually, what he's doing is not great. He is wearing underwear. He's almost naked. Thank you very much.